Welcome to our second lesson for second semester Greek. This lesson we are going to be covering the second aorist form for the active and middle voice, and that corresponds with chapter 16 in our textbook by Ray Summers. And then in the second portion of this lesson we'll cover the aorist and future passive indicative forms. That corresponds with chapter 17 of our textbook. So let's begin as we see the alpha symbol there for the beginning of our course. Let's dig in now. Now regarding verb tense forms, we've covered in Greek Grammar 1 and now in Greek Grammar 2, semester 2, so far the present, future, imperfect, and aorist tense forms. And if I could just draw that for you here, that would comprise this section right here. We'll cover by the end of today the second aorist form, so I'm going to include that. And we will have studied by the end of this lesson all three voices for all of these tense forms in the indicative mood, and all three persons, and of course singular and plural for all of those. So I think this is encouraging to see that by the end of this lesson today, we've got a big chunk of all the possible verb forms that you will study for Greek under our belt. We just have a few left to go in the imperative, subjunctive, optative moods, as well as perfect and pluperfect tense forms. Now, before we start to look at the different forms for the second aorist, active and middle indicative, and then the passive forms for the aorist and future tense verbs, I want to just go back and review for a moment this issue of looking at verbs from three dimensions or three parts. And I want to really hammer this point home so that you develop a way of thinking about verbs every single time you encounter a verb. You should be asking yourself, what are its three parts? Its aspect, its action start, and the time of the action. And just like the most fundamental rule of Bible interpretation is asking yourself questions about the context, when you pick up a Bible and you read a verse, you always need to be thinking and training your mind to think in terms of context, and that includes the who, what, when, where, why type questions. Who's writing this? Who is receiving this? Is it an epistle of Paul? Who are the recipients? Is it the Philippians or the Colossians? What do we know about them in terms of their background? That may help with our interpretation. What is being discussed here? What's the main subject matter? When is this epistle, let's say, being written? What are the circumstances as to why this epistle is being written? Where is it being written from? So those are the sorts of questions that we always ask ourselves in terms of context for a particular passage. And we need to do the same thing when it comes to verbs in particular. We need to ask the question, what is the aspect of the writer or the speaker for the passage that we're reading? Every writer or speaker has a certain perspective of an action. And we need to put ourselves literally in the shoes of that person who's viewing the action or speaking about the action, so that we see the action from their perspective, not from our perspective, but from theirs. It's very important that we do that. That's what aspect is all about. And then when it comes to action start, we saw in our last lesson for the aorist that there are multiple different types of action just for the aorist. And that's a second question that we need to ask ourselves, and that's determined by context again. And then the third question is, what is the time of the action? Did it occur in the past, present, or future? And I underscore this for you because, again, this should become second nature for you as we go through verbs in Greek, that you learn to think in these three dimensions. Now let me review for a moment again what aspect in particular is, so that there is no confusion about this, because this is something, again, that we normally don't think about as primarily English-speaking students. Aspect, again, is the perspective of an action by the writer or the speaker. And when we speak of aspect, we're usually using distinctions between, at least for the perfect tense and the aorist tense, the difference between an imperfective versus perfective aspect for the action. Again, the imperfective aspect is viewing an action as a close-up, proximate, your curbside to the action, like a parade going on right in front of you, that's in progress. That's how you're viewing it. You're inside the action, so to speak. And the present and imperfect tense forms are used for this. When it comes to the perfective aspect, again, you've zoomed out, you've got the bird's eye view, you're on top of a building or in an airplane or a helicopter or a hot air balloon over the parade, and you're looking down from that perspective. You see things as from beginning to end as complete or whole in summary fashion. You have a remote perspective, and usually the aorist tense form is, in fact, the aorist tense form does always convey this remote aspect. Now, let me just explain some of the terminology that's involved for aspect, as sometimes this is confusing for people. When I say imperfective versus perfective, and then I switch to proximate versus remote, I'm not talking about different things. These are just three sets of contrasts that are really synonymous with one another. And some Greek grammarians prefer to use the language of imperfective versus perfective. Others like to say proximate versus remote. Others say it's internal aspect versus external aspect. Buste Fanning, for example, in his book on verbal aspect, he likes to speak in terms of internal versus external. Other grammarians, like Constantine Campbell, likes to speak of proximate versus remote. But you will find as you read commentaries and Greek grammar books that are up to date on verbal aspect that almost all of them prefer to use the terminology of imperfective versus perfective. But just don't be thrown off, and the reason I'm explaining this is so that you realize that these terms are interchangeable, so long as you recognize that these are three sets of contrasts that really essentially mean the same thing. So when I use this terminology, don't think that I'm referring to something different when I say imperfective versus perfective, and then I switch to proximate versus remote. I'm still describing the same thing, just with different terminology. Now, thinking of aspect in particular, you need to be able to think when you encounter a certain verb tense form, like the present tense form, luo, or the imperfect tense form, eluan, etc., or the future tense form or aorist tense forms. When you see those forms, you need immediately in your mind to be thinking of what is the aspect that is inherently conveyed by that tense form. And you should think immediately for present tense form, you should think imperfective, or imperfect tense form, imperfective. Future tense form, you should think perfective aspect, and same with aorist. And then you should understand that those things refer to the standpoint of the writer or speaker viewing the action. That the present tense form means you're proximate to the action, you're up close. Imperfect tense form means you're still proximate, but maybe you're a little farther away from the action, but you're not as far away as, let's say, the aorist tense form would convey in terms of being remote. And future tense form, keep in mind, that's the only one in which all Greek grammarians recognize that it inherently conveys time. When you speak of something that's future, it truly is future in the sense of time. So there's a temporal remoteness involved there. So be able to think in these categories when you see a particular tense form. So again, when we come to the aorist tense form, let's say, whether it's first aorist or second aorist, as we'll learn today, regardless of the form, if it's aorist, it's going to have a particular aspect. When it comes to the aorist tense form, it will always be perfective, remote, external aspect. You can bank on that. Just assume that. That is an invariable, fixed, given conclusion. Now, what is not fixed is action sart for the aorist tense form. We saw in the last lesson that the aorist tense form is capable of being used in a variety of ways to describe different kinds of action. And that's dependent largely on the context as well as the nature of the verb. And there is some disagreement on certain verbs in certain contexts as to what kind of action sart they really have. And I gave you in the last lesson 7 different uses or kinds of action that are possible. And then when it comes to time, we know that the aorist tense form is flexible as well. It can be used for past, present, or future time for an action. And so you have all these different variables that you have to keep in mind. It's not just three variables, aspect, action, start, and time. It is aspect, which is a one-to-one correspondence. It will always be perfective aspect. But in regards to action start, it could be any one of at least 7 different uses of the aorist. And when it comes to time, it could be any one of 3 time tenses. And so you've got quite a bit of variety capable of expression for the aorist tense form, and thus for different interpretations of passages. So be aware of that as you are an exegete and not just learning the grammar and forms for different verb tenses in Greek. Okay, now let's begin to look at the verb formation for the second aorist tense form. But before we do, let's just take a moment and review the first aorist verb formation in terms of its morphology, and I think this will help you understand better second aorist and the contrast between first and second aorist. Now, as I explained in the last lesson, aorist tense verbs are formed in 2 different ways. Thus, we have the 2 categories of a first aorist versus second aorist. So think of them as 2 different kinds of spellings for an aorist tense verb. However, though their morphology may be different, whether it's first or second aorist, they function exactly the same way. So we don't have to relearn, for example, in this lesson on second aorist verbs, we don't have to learn anything new about the significance or usage of the aorist tense. It's exactly the same as it was for first aorist. It's just a matter of verbs being spelled 2 different ways. Now, most verbs, like let's take our example that we've been using throughout this course for luo, I loose, the present tense lexical form luo, when it is used in the aorist tense, it's always going to be a first aorist. It does not have a second aorist form. But there are some verbs that occur with 2 different spellings for the aorist. They may have both a first aorist and a second aorist spelling. That's pretty rare or less common, but most verbs are going to have either a first aorist form or a second aorist form, but a few of them actually have both. And the only way you're going to know what the actual form is by looking at your principal parts list or a Greek lexicon. Now, in terms of review for the first aorist before we look at the second aorist, remember that the formation of first aorist verbs includes several parts to the particular verb. Here we're looking at elusamen, which is first aorist, active indicative, first person plural of luo. Would be translated here, elusamen would be translated we loosed. The tense sign, you'll see the sigma there in the middle of the word. Second aorist verbs do not have this tense sign. That's one significant difference that we're going to see between first aorist and second aorist. The second aorist form will have a change in the stem rather than this sigma tense sign. But with first aorist verbs, you also see the connecting vowel, alpha, for first aorist here. And then remember, with present and imperfect tense verbs, the connecting vowel was usually omicron or epsilon, and with aorist tense, it's usually going to be alpha. And then they have the same endings. Here, the first person plural ending, men, mu, epsilon, nu, which is the same ending for first person plural verbs regardless of the tense. And just in terms of review, here again is the paradigm for the first aorist active indicative forms of luo. And so you have first person singular, elusa, I loosed, second person singular, elusas, you loosed, third person singular, he, she, or it loosed, elusen, and then first person plural, elusamen, we loosed, and second person plural, elusata, you or ye loosed in Old English, and then third person plural, they loosed, elusan. Now we move on to the first aorist middle indicative, middle voice of luo, where we would have, in terms of the glosses or translations, without any context, you would have elusamein, I loosed myself for first person singular. Second person singular, eluso, you loosed yourself. Third person singular, eluseta, he loosed himself, or you could say she loosed herself, it loosed itself, depending on the context. And then first person plural, elusametha, we loosed ourselves. Second person plural, elusestha, you loosed yourselves. Third person plural, elusanta, they loosed themselves. Now keep in mind that this is the middle voice, so I've provided in these glosses or mini translations here without context the standard reflexive middle understanding. I loosed myself, etc. But you could understand these middle voices to be also indirect middles, in which case we would translate it, I loosed for myself, you loosed for yourself, he loosed for himself, etc. And keep in mind that with the middle voice, the basic idea is that the subject is acting with self-interest. The emphasis is not so much on the action with the middle voice as it is upon the actor, the one doing the action of the verb. Now what we have here is the first aorist active indicative forms, but here I've highlighted in red for you the tense sign for first active indicative, and by the way, a middle voice would have the same sigma sign there as well. When you see this, it's a clue to you that okay, right in the middle of the word after the stem, there's a sigma. Does that mean that this is present tense? No, present tense doesn't have this tense sign in there, nor is it going to be imperfect tense, but it could be future tense and it could be aorist tense. Now, if there's an augment on the beginning of the word, like you see here, lusa, etc., then you know it's going to be aorist tense because future tense doesn't have an augment again. And so this is a sign again to tip you off that, hey, we've got an aorist tense form that we're dealing with here. Now, in contrast to the first aorist, what we're looking at here is the second aorist active indicative form, and you'll notice that I've switched verbs from luo to lείπω, and that's because luo does not have a second aorist form. Now, with the second aorist active indicative verbs, there are a few things to note regarding these verbs. First of all, you've got a stem change, and they don't first of all have the sigma, as we mentioned, the tense sign that's characteristic of first aorist verbs. That's missing here with the second aorist active indicative form. And then secondly, you've got a change in the stem from lείπω to lip as the stem. The epsilon has dropped out. And that's normally the case, as we'll see, with second aorist verbs. The other thing to note is they have an augment, so the epsilon precedes lείπω, lipon, etc., all the way through those various forms. And then the third thing to note is that the endings, elipon, elipes, elipe, elipamen, elipeta, elipon, etc., they should look very familiar to you. The ending is the same as we see here for the imperfect active indicative of lείπω. So the imperfect tense forms you've already learned, and here they're just reintroduced for the second aorist active. And so what would be the difference between the second aorist active indicative of lείπω versus the imperfect active indicative? They have an augment, they have the same endings. The difference is in the stem. You'll notice that the stem is whole or complete for the imperfect tense form, whereas it changes, the epsilon drops out for the aorist tense form, the second aorist tense form. So you just have to be really keen to note some of these differences. Again, note the contrast between the second aorist active indicative of lείπω, which you see here. The stem has changed, versus the imperfect active indicative of lείπω, where there is no stem change. They look very similar to one another, and you just have to have a watchful eye about that minor difference in the stem. Now, something else you need to note regarding aorist tense verbs is that they are sometimes irregular. In other words, they don't really match their present tense form. So you cannot assume that the stem of a verb is the same in the aorist as it was in the present tense. Here are two examples for you. Lego, corresponding with its aorist tense form, apon. Now what happened in this case, historically, and this is probably helpful for you to understand a little bit of historical background to know what's going on here with present versus aorist, is the Greeks used to use a verb, probably, we think, a present tense form of a verb called epo, and so its aorist tense form was apon, and there's a similarity between those two. But epo probably dropped out along the way, and yet the Greeks continued to use apon as an aorist tense form for I said or I spoke, and consequently apon began to be used for a different verb in the present tense, lego. And so that's what we were left with by the Koine period. Apon was used as the aorist tense form for lego rather than its original present tense verb epo. And something similar probably happened with the word below that, adon, in the aorist tense form. It probably came from a present tense form, ado, but along the way, ado dropped out, and so now you have a marriage, so to speak, between the aorist tense form adon and blepo or horao, meaning I see. And so adon, meaning I saw, began to be used more frequently along with or as the aorist tense form of blepo or horao. Now those are just two examples, and I will say this, the only way, again, that you're going to know the true aorist tense form of a verb for the present tense is to look it up in your principal parts chart. You will recall that the aorist tense form of a present tense verb is in the third column of the principal parts list. So if you know the present tense form of a verb, you look on the far left column. To know its aorist tense form, you just go over 2 columns to the aorist tense column, and you'll see the correct aorist tense form for that verb. And so going back to the second aorist active indicative forms again, for, in this case, lείπω is our lexical word. We have first person singular, elipon, second person singular, elipes, third person singular, elipe, or the movable nu, elipen, and then elipamen, elipete, elipon. Now here is the second aorist middle indicative forms of lείπω, and just as we saw with the second aorist active indicative forms, they corresponded with the imperfect tense forms that you've already learned. The same is going to be true here now with the middle voice for second aorist indicative. So, for example, you're not having to learn any new connecting vowels or endings. It's going to be elipamen, which means in the middle voice it would mean I left for myself, or elipu, you left for yourself, elipeta, he, she, or it left for himself, herself, itself, etc., or elipametha, we left for ourselves, elipestha, you left for yourselves, elipanta, they left for themselves. Now, having looked at how second aorist verbs are formed, let's introduce our vocabulary list now for chapter 16, because all of these words are not new words in terms of new meanings. You've had these words before in the present tense form. Now you're simply just seeing how they look in the second aorist spelling, and so it's easier in that respect. Let's just go through these from the top, starting with ago, meaning I lead. The second aorist form would be ήγαγον, I led. Next on the list would be apothnesko, meaning I die. And then the second aorist form would be apeithenon, which means I died. And then you have balo, meaning I cast or I throw. And then you have ebelon, meaning I threw or cast. And then you have blepo, meaning I see, or adon, as we already saw in a previous slide. That means I saw, adon. And that again is a very different spelling for the second aorist as compared to the present tense form. Next on the list you have ginomai, which means I become, and it's deponent. You'll notice the middle and passive voice endings. However, it's functionally active voice in the present tense. And here it also happens to be deponent for the second aorist spelling, again amen. And what's interesting here to note with ginomai and aganamen is that both are deponent in the aorist form, second aorist, as well as the present. That's not always going to be the case. For as you look a little further down the list, you see erkamai, which means I come or I go, and then you'll see its second aorist spelling, eilthon, I came or I went. Now that's not deponent in the second aorist. So don't assume that just because a verb was deponent in the present tense form that it's going to be in its second aorist or aorist spelling. The only way again to know that is by looking at your principal parts list. And I will say regarding erkamai, all its compounds again, d-erkamai, ace-erkamai, x-erkamai, etc., they're all deponent in the present tense, but not in the aorist tense. And then on our list, we also have gnosko, meaning I know, and in its aorist form, I knew, is egnon. Continuing on our list, our next word is estheo, meaning I eat, and in the second aorist form, I ate, it would be ephagon. And then you have echo, meaning I have, or eskon in the aorist tense form, I had. And then you have lambano, I take or receive in the present tense, and in the aorist tense form, it's el-laban, I took or received. Then you have lego, I say or speak in the present tense, and apon, very different spelling again, for the second aorist form. Apon would mean I said or I spoke. And then you have lepo, meaning I leave, or in the aorist, second aorist spelling, elipon, I left. And then paralambano, I take, receive, and its aorist tense spelling, second aorist, it would be parelaban, I took or received. And lastly, we have pasco, I suffer, in its aorist tense form, epithon, I suffered, pipto, I fall, and epison, I fell. And then pharaoh, I bear or I bring, and then anekon, which is the second aorist spelling, and aneka, which is the first aorist spelling. In either case, it's translated or understood as I bore or brought, but this is a rare instance of a verb where you can have two different types of spelling for the aorist tense, either first or second aorist. Now, so far we have covered the first and second aorist active and middle voice indicative mood verb forms. What I'd like to do now is shift to the content of chapter 17 in our textbook, which deals with both first and second aorist passive voice indicative mood verb forms, as well as we'll see the future tense passive indicative. But starting with first and second aorist, first of all, we have here the first aorist passive indicative forms, and let's just go through these rather quickly. Eleuthein, which means I was loosed, or eleuthes, you were loosed. Eleuthe, he, she, or it was loosed. Eleuthemen, we were loosed. Eleutheta, you were loosed, you plural. Eleuthesan, they were loosed. With the first aorist passive indicative, I've highlighted for you in color-coded certain identifying features of the first aorist passive indicative. You'll notice the theta-eta combination highlighted in red, along with the endings in yellow. And so whenever you see the theta-eta combination, you'll know that this is first aorist passive. Just like the first aorist and active voice and middle voice had the sigma after the stem of the word as a tense sign indicator, letting you know it's aorist tense. Well, this is similar in the sense that it's indicating for you that this is first aorist passive voice. Now here we have the second aorist passive indicative, and it's very similar to the first aorist passive indicative in the previous slide. But the difference here is that you'll notice that the theta dropped out. For the second aorist, as well as the first aorist, they have the same connecting vowel, the eta, and the same endings. But the difference is going to be the dropout of the theta. Once again, here is the first aorist passive indicative form with the theta, and now the second aorist passive indicative form without the theta. And here is an example taken from a verse in the New Testament in John 13, verse 31, where we have, in the setting anyway, the context, you have the gathering of the disciples with the Lord Jesus, and Judas has just gone out at this point. And so what we have here is an interesting example of two uses of the verb doxazo in the present tense, I glorify, or here in the aorist tense. And you'll note that they are both first aorist uses of the aorist tense of doxazo, and it's third person singular in both cases. I've highlighted for you the theta eta combination at the end of the word or the stem there for doxazo. The zeta has turned into a sigma in order to allow for the theta eta combination to meet it. But what we have here is, in essence, a translation where, or use of the aorist, where we wouldn't translate it as something that was past tense, even though it's aorist indicative, which often is going to be translated as a past tense action. Here, it definitely is not past tense. It's actually present or even perhaps future tense. So in order to translate this verse, we would translate hata un ex eilthen lege Iesus, meaning therefore when he had gone out, Jesus said, and what does Jesus say? Noon is now, edoxasthe, now the Son of Man, ha huios tu anthropou, now the Son of Man is glorified. There's your aorist tense indicative mood, and its passive voice. Now the Son of Man is glorified. Kai hatheos edoxasthe en auto, meaning and God is glorified in him. So we would translate the two aorist uses here, third person singular in reference to the Son of Man as well as God the Father that is. We would translate that as a present or even perhaps future use with the aorist. We wouldn't translate it this way. Now the Son of Man was glorified and God was glorified in him now that Judas has gone out. That doesn't make any sense at all. Now, having seen the passive voice endings for the first and second aorist indicatives, let's look at the future passive indicative endings now, or forms for these words, starting with first person singular, luthes amai, which means I will be loosed, future passive, and then luthes say, you will be loosed, luthesatai, he, she, or it will be loosed, luthes amatha, we will be loosed, luthesistha, you, plural, will be loosed, and luthesantai, they will be loosed. Here's the future passive indicative with color codes to highlight the different parts of the verb. And you'll notice that the endings, first of all, in yellow are the same as for the present tense, middle and passive voice. And then you'll notice that the future tense middle voice endings are going to be the same as the future tense passive indicative endings with their connecting vowels. So you won't have to learn anything new in terms of endings. The only thing to recognize is that center portion there, that after the stem, lu, you have the thes combination of letters, theta, eta, and sigma. The sigma, again, is a distinguishing feature, a tense sign for the future tense verbs. Remember, sigma was inserted For example, with future active indicative, luso, luces, luce, lusamen, etc., as well as with the future middle voice indicative mood verbs. And here it's in the passive voice for the future as well. The difference is that it combines with the theta eta passive voice sign that we already saw for the for the first aorist passive voice combination. Now here we have in Acts chapter 1 verse 5 an example of a verse that uses baptizo twice, one in the aorist tense and the other in the future tense, as we'll see. Now if we were to translate this, hati Ioannes men ebaptisen hudati, that would be translated for John, in reference to John the Baptist. For John, indeed, truly, sometimes people leave the word men untranslated. For John baptized, or you could say for John truly or indeed baptized. But the word ebaptisen is aorist active indicative third person singular for John doing the baptizing himself. And how did he do it? He did it with water. So you see the dative form there. If you follow the 5-case form understanding, we have been teaching the 8-case form here. So we would say with water would be instrumental, instead of hudor, it would be hudati here, which would be instrumental case. He baptized with water. And then humes de en pneumati baptisthesistha hagio ou meta polas tautas hemeros. And so it would be translated, but you will be baptized in or by the Holy Spirit not many days from now. And that second use of baptizo there is future passive indicative, second person, plural in form. Baptisthesistha. And you'll notice the portion highlighted in red, that indicates for us again that it's a future tense passive voice, because you've got the theta eta combination along with the tense sign there, the sigma, to show you that this is future tense. You will be baptized, you plural will be baptized in the future. And so we've seen the second aorist forms for active voice, middle voice, and passive voice, plus future passive voice forms. Now let's see the infinitive forms. Now here we have the present tense, first and second aorist tense forms for all three voices, active, middle, and passive. Remember that when it comes to infinitives, they don't have person or number. So that makes our paradigm here very simplified to understand or memorize. You don't have to worry about first, second, and third person subjects, whether they're singular or plural. You just have to memorize this one form to go with each tense and voice for infinitives. Now let's start with the present active infinitive, lu ein. This would be translated to loose, or the present middle infinitive, lu esthai, and that would be translated to loose, to be loosing oneself. And then present passive, lu esthai, that would be to be loosed. And again, we don't have to worry about first, second, or third person, singular or plural. Now in the first aorist column, you'll see the sigma is added there to the stem for lu, for the middle and passive voice, and then the theta eta combination for the passive voice, first aorist. And so these would be translated or understood lucai for first aorist active, lucai would be to loose, and first aorist middle, loosesthai, would be to loose oneself, and first aorist passive, luthenai, would be to be loosed. And then second aorist, lipein, active voice, that would be translated to leave, from lepo, I leave, So lipane would be to leave. And then second aorist middle voice, lipesthai, that would be translated or understood to leave oneself, middle voice. Remember, it's self-interest is the middle voice. And then second aorist passive voice infinitive would be lipenai, would be translated to be left. Now, having looked at the aorist and future passive indicative forms, now let's move on to our vocabulary list for chapter 17, which is going to be completely aorist passive forms of words we've already studied in the present tense. So you're not learning any new words in terms of meanings, just a different form, the aorist passive form. There are no future passive indicative forms for these words. We're just going to omit that and look at the aorist passive forms. And by the way, when it comes to the forms of these words, you will see in your principal parts lists that in the 6 columns to the far right, the 6th column will actually be the aorist passive forms of words. So they get their own column in the principal parts list because sometimes the changes are quite dramatic and you may not recognize them as easily. So thankfully, the principal parts list has that separate listing or column for you. Now let's start at the top with a word we've already learned, akuo, meaning I hear. In its aorist passive form, it would be akusthein, I was heard. Next is apokrinomai in the present tense, and you'll notice its deponent there, meaning it has, again, middle and passive form endings, and yet it is active in function. The same is going to be true with its aorist passive spelling. Even though it looks aorist passive in spelling, it's actually going to be understood as an active voice in function. And so that form, aorist passive of apokrinomai, is going to be apokrithein. But again, you would translate it as active voice. Instead of I was answered, you would translate it I answered. Next on the list is apostello, I send out, and its aorist passive form would be apostolain, I was sent out. Now again, notice this word apostolain. There's no theta in the middle of the word as a passive voice letter sign to tip you off that this is passive voice. And there's also a stem change involved from apostello to apostolain. And that tells you, those two things, the lack of the theta and the stem change, tell you that this is a second aorist passive form, to be technically correct. Next on the list would be balo, I cast or I throw, and then eblethein, I was thrown or cast. And then we have ginomai, a very common word, meaning I become. It's deponent there, again, middle and passive voice ending, but yet active in function. And the same is going to be true with its aorist passive spelling. Though it's passive in spelling, it's active in function. Agenethein, meaning I became. Next on the list is gnosko, I know, and then egnosthein, I was known. And then grapho, I write, and egraphein, I was written. I don't know if that's actually a word that's ever used, but that would be its aorist passive spelling form. Now notice with egraphein again, that this is going to be a second aorist passive verb form because, again, there's no theta in the word to show you that this is the passive voice letter sign. And again, there's also a stem change. Actually, there's not a stem change, but it has that ending common to all aorist endings. But since it has no theta, it's going to be a second aorist passive. Next on the list is didasko, present tense, and then edidoxthein would be the aorist passive form, I was taught. Then we have doxadzo, I glorify, and then edoxasthein, which would mean I was glorified. Then we have agero, I raise up, or agerthein, I was raised up. And then keruso, I preach or proclaim. And then ekeruxthein, I was proclaimed. And then krino, meaning I judge. And then akrithein, meaning I was judged. And then lastly, we have lambano for this slide, meaning I take or receive. And then elamphein, very different spelling for the passive voice form. Elamphein, meaning I was taken or I was received. And then we have lêpo, I leave, in its aorist passive form. Elaphthein, I was left. And then pempo, I send. And then epemphein, I was sent. And then paruamai, deponent in the present tense. It's also going to be deponent in the aorist passive there. Eparuthein, meaning I went. Active voice now instead of I was gone. He would translate it I went. And the next and last word is sozo, I save, and then its aorist passive form is esothein, I was saved. And so that ends our vocabulary list. And that's it for this lesson as well. Again, nothing new in terms of the meaning of the aorist in its second aorist forms, or even the passive voice forms for aorist and future. Nothing new in terms of meaning or significance, just different forms that you should be aware of.